Welcome back, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with our second session, and our second panel, we'll let people continue to come in for the next few minutes. I very much enjoyed the first panel discussion. I still have not made my final decision as to whether to go long or short, oil or gas at this point, but I've got some more data points, and I'm going to wait until after this next panel before I pull the trigger on anything. The moderator for our second panel is Bruce Stover. He's the president of BHS Enterprises. He's a retired executive vice president and was a founding member of Endeavor International Corporation, which was an independent North Sea focused exploration and production company. So like Mike, he has a lot of overseas experience, also international experience. He has more than 38 years of experience in the oil and gas industry. As I said, extensive experience in international business development. Previously served as a senior vice president of worldwide business development for Anadarko Petroleum Corporation, and he also served as president general manager of the company's Algerian subsidiary, and Bruce was also one of the principal parties that was involved in the 2000 merger of Anadarko and Union Pacific. Bruce preceded me, as I think we mentioned earlier, as the chairman of the advisory board for the Energy Institute, and I can tell you, like Dr. Ghosh, Bruce spends countless hours working on matters that relate to the Institute and ensuring that we continue to make progress and success. So he's obviously very well qualified to be a moderator today, and I'm going to turn it over to Bruce.
Welcome back, everyone. If anybody's out there kind of coming to get your seats, I want to quickly introduce the topic for our panel today and introduce our speakers for this panel session. It'll be about an hour and a half. We'll do the same format as we did before. The purpose of this panel session is to look at the concepts of strategy for energy for the United States and policy and what right policy might look like for the United States going forward. I think going back to Daniel Pullen's comments in his opening statements, he focused on three areas that are perhaps inarguable in terms of interest of all Americans, no matter what your political persuasion is. And what we want to do, and those 3 points were a stable, growing, low volatility economy, confidence in our foreign relations and the security and our national security, and then finally continuous incremental improvement in the environment we live in all aspects of the environment. And as you'll remember, Daniel made the point that energy and the energy position we have as a country, the technology that has driven that has a substantial impact on all those things, and yet we don't hear much about it. As a matter of fact, the energy industry is demonized in many ways, partly because the environmental questions have kind of superseded all the discussion and driven all the discussion in terms of what energy ought to look like. All of us in this room are from Oklahoma or Texas or someplace we've been involved in and been around the energy industry, so it concerns us when we see energy demonized, and yet it really does underpin the foundation of our society in terms of the economy, national security, and indeed our environmental quality. And we'll talk more about that today. What we want to do is focus on sort of an idea that we talked about last night at dinner. I shared some thoughts at dinner last night. I don't think, at least in my lifetime, and it probably goes back before this, I don't think our country has ever been in as good a position as it is right now in terms of the breadth and depth of our energy resource mix and potential to do the things we need to do to positively affect the economy, our national security, and the environment. There was a big step change in World War II, at the end of World War II, which was phenomenal change. The development of our oil reserves in this country to drive the energy needed for the war on two fronts was dramatic. The technological impact, rotary drilling, bits, geology, all the geophysics, all those things that drove that step change in supply were driven by a crisis, and that was World War II. Arguably, we're not, and probably, after World War I, there was a similar setback. Only one of us in the room was probably around it in World War I, so we can't really comment on it live. But I think the point is we're in an extraordinary position, and I feel like we're kind of squandering it because we're looking at reading the labels on the first rack we come to, and arguing about a lot of things that, and taken into context, if you look at the whole, may make a lot of difference in how we view, all of us, every American, no matter what political persuasion might view, to say this is a reasonable way to go forward and we ought to take advantage of the position we're in. So I'm going to introduce our panelists today. I'll just start down here. Scott Sheffield is the Chairman, Chief Executive Officer of Pioneer Natural Resources in Fort Worth, Dallas? Irving. Well, you've kind of morphed together, haven't they? So, Scott is a petroleum engineering graduate from the University of Texas, and I know this because I recruited him when I was working for Amoco as a young engineer in our Houston office, and recruited him, probably one of the best catches I ever had. So, glad to have him here. Mark Mills is a senior fellow for the Manhattan Institute. He has written a book called The Bottomless Well, co-authored a book called The Bottomless Well, which came out about 10 years ago. Fantastic book about the evolution of energy in our country, and with particular emphasis on the role of technology and how it's impacted that growth. Next is Rusty Brazil. Rusty runs a consulting firm out of Houston, and really they specialize in all things energy. We're going to have him talk a lot about LNG today, and natural gas's role in the energy mix. Next to him is Mark Snell. Mark is the president of Sempra Energy in San Diego. Mark is the business of Sempra is primary business is electric power generation and natural gas. A lot of other services and goods and products that they provide. It's a big company. We maybe haven't heard around it heard much about it this part of the world, but it's a big company. I think you've got 32,000 customers around the world and operate in a number of different countries, including Mexico. And I want to spend some time talking about Mexico today and a geopolitical point of view. And then next to him is Hal Quinn. Hal is a representative of president of the National Mining Association in Washington, D.C. He represents the coal industry, among other mining interests. I want Hal to be here to really kind of represent the full gamut of the resource potential we've got. Coal has been, until recently, and still very much so, the core of one of the core contributors to electric power generation in this country. As they say in the play, I guess the Monty Python, we ain't dead yet. And it's still a long-term safety net for this country because of the high-quality coal that we have in our energy resource mix. So these are our panelists. I'm going to start by asking the panelists to just to continue the discussion from this morning. Are there any comments that you guys would like to make to kind of following up the comments from the first panel session to kind of carry through into our theme? Anybody want to make a Mark? Go ahead.
I thought I'd just comment a little bit on some of the LNG questions, since we're a developer of LNG export facilities in Louisiana and in Mexico. And one of the things that I think that we all have to do is just take a little bit of a deep breath and wait, because really the full impact of U.S. exports obviously hasn't really begun yet. Cheniere has just started shipping their first cargoes the last month or so. But I would say by the end of 2019, we'll be seeing somewhere in the neighborhood of about 8 BCF a day to 9 BCF a day being exported out of the United States, and that is a lot of gas. And we can easily see that going to 12 to 15 BCF a day by 2023, 2024. So those are fairly significant numbers, and the kind of infrastructure change and the kinds of changes that are going to happen to support that industry are also just now really getting underway. I mean, the development of additional pipelines and other facilities in the Gulf to do this. So I think you'll see over the next few years what the real effect of this will be. And I think from a geopolitical perspective, to be able to become a supplier to China and to be a major supplier to Japan, Korea, that will give the U.S. and I don't know that it's leverage that they can use, but it's certainly going to give us some influence that we don't currently have, and I think that's a very positive development.
Bruce, in your comments, you talked about the benefits to the economy and the benefits of everything that's happening in the energy business to us, and I just didn't hear it clearly this morning. And neither in your comments either, about the fact that we have to deal with the fact that the United States is effectively on the margin here, and that's the experience that we're having right now in the energy markets here in Oklahoma, is that when we produce more than we can use in the world, prices come down. That's exactly what's happened, and in that case, then we cut back production. Cutting back production means that's a lot of pain for a lot of folks. We've talked about the fact that when that happens, there is a distinct possibility that production will fall in the United States, and when it does fall in the United States, then prices are going to come right back up again. I think we could be dealing with that situation for a very, very long time, where prices fall and increase and fall and increase because the production here is on the margin. That will be a good thing for our country. It will be a very difficult thing for our industry to be able to cope with.
That's a good point. Any other comments from this morning, Scott?
Yeah, Bruce, it's great to be here and great to see you again. So since you hired me, start my career with Amoco. A couple of comments. First, I know Ed Morris is a good friend, but Harold Hamm did not single-handedly lift the export ban. So I started going there in 2011. Made about 40 trips to D.C. Ryan Lance and I at ConocoPhillips formed PACE about 2 years ago. So there were other people besides Harold that participated. So Harold may think he did it single-handedly. So, secondly, I get asked all the time by media, by shareholders. The most common question that I get is, what can the U.S. do? When is the U.S. going to start adding back rigs? When is Pioneer going to start adding back rigs? This is an interesting chart that I used to testify with in Congress during the lifting the export ban. And I can promise you at $40 oil, $45 oil, the U.S. cannot grow production. At $50 oil, I don't think we can grow production. The reason is because Pioneer, I've learned through 5 downturns, you got to have a great balance sheet. So we have actually zero debt. We have $2.5 billion in cash and $2.5 billion in debt. So zero debt today, essentially. We have a great hedge position. We're the only large companies growing oil today. Returns are still good at $35, $40, $45 oil. You just don't have enough cash flow in that margin when you take out your operating costs, your G&A, and interest to reinvest fast enough to grow U.S. production. You need $60 oil to really, in my opinion, to grow U.S. production. And we've modeled our own company, and we have some of the best assets in the country with zero debt, and we cannot grow at $50 oil long-term more than a couple years. So if we can't do it, I don't think anybody else can do it. Secondly, the debt picture of the the entire upstream industry had $200 billion of debt 10 years ago. They ended up, before this downturn started, $550 billion of debt. So there is way too much debt from inside the U.S. of companies. It reminds me of the early 80s. Pemex, Mexico, Petrobras, Brazil. There was way too much debt. So a lot of people, even when oil prices come back, are going to have to pay off a lot of debt before they can start adding rigs.
Good point. Mark, you want to make any comments from this morning? Follow up this morning?
Sure. I think that, two quick comments. One is the context for the geopolitics, which is anchored in technology. I'm fundamentally a technologist, as you know. I'm not an oil and gas guy, although I play one on TV, as they say. And I came to study the oil and gas industry from the vector of technology, fundamentally, not from a resource perspective. And it's perhaps obvious in an oil state, but I'll state it because the industry is, in terms of both supply and demand, is essentially dominated first and foremost by technology. It's not, oil demand didn't get created by oil companies. Right? The invention of the automobile was not driven by oil, the existence of oil. In fact, the first cars, as all of you probably know, were electric powered because that's what was easiest. And the oil engines were very tough to build and make reliable. Supply side is entirely a technology feature. I mean, it's the first steam drill, famously. And no one thought during the peak of the peak oil theory that we were going to have lots more oil in the world everywhere, not just in the shale fields. But the Gulf of Mexico was finished, we were told. North Sea was on a steep decline. It's declining because it's expensive, but no one even believed pre-North Sea that there was North Sea oil that you could afford to ever extract, much less look for. So every turn in the oil and gas markets is driven by what engineers end up figuring out how to do with technologies and tools that evolve. And they're not technologies and tools that are first and foremost created in the oil and gas industry. They're the toolkit of technologies broadly. So I would argue that the shale revolution is as much an artifact of the declining cost, increasing power of information technologies as anything else, broadly speaking, because that's how materials are made better, steel is made better, manufacturing and pipes are cheaper, seismic's cheap, everything gets cheaper. So today, this is where I would disagree slightly because I have the luxury of not having to anymore report a balance sheet on a public company. When I was briefly chairman, I took a tech company public, and I was a founding chairman and CTO, and I was eager and keen to get off the board when we had to deconflict it. In IPOs, you have to deconflict after a while because doing forecasting in the public domain is when you are responsible for fiduciary business is challenging. So there's no question right now where the price point is for the U.S. shale industry to operate. But let's just do the thought experiment. If we talked about what the price point was for shale 12, 15 years ago, we know what the answer was. It was not infinite, but it was a high number. I mean, people knew shale had a lot of oil and gas in its source rock. But there was really no land rush into producing shale with the technology that was available 15 years ago. Technology changed. So my basic premise when I talk to engineers, and I spend time both privately and publicly trying to find smart people in the oil and gas business who can talk off the record, is what are you doing next? What are you working on? Not what they're going to tell their bosses they're working on, not what they're going to promise how much more effective the drilling speed will be, or how much cheaper the rig will be, or how much more accurate the seismic will be. These are not reported up the food chain, not because they don't want to tell the boss, but because it's not proven out yet. But across the entire ecosystem of the shale industry, which is a very new industry by petroleum standards, there's an incredible bubbling up of technology that has not been implemented or proven or validated, but all of it will make it cheaper. So my forecast is the 50 is the bogey where we're okay. I think that number, and I think people who are in the business know this, keeps going down, not up. This resource base is a cheaper resource base over time to access because of technology, which is, in the short term, doesn't solve any problems for balance sheets of overstressed companies. They will go bankrupt and they'll get acquired by predators, so-called vulture capital, of which is roughly, it's interesting, the numbers I found for vulture capital are roughly symmetrically the same as the amount of distressed debt. There's about $500 billion of dry powder across all the various financial markets ready to invest in the oil and gas industry in the United States, both foreign and domestic. And there's about $500 billion of more, let's say, distressed debt. The fire sales haven't really started yet. People I've talked to privately are saying they're essentially they're waiting. They're waiting for bottom, which is not encouraging if I'm a producer. So I think the revolution is just beginning. I wrote a paper called Shale 2.0 because I think the technology makes it clear we're going to go through a growth curve that's going to go up and dip down. I think the down dip on U.S. shale production lasts a couple of years, if I had to guess. And then prices recover, 50-ish. But the cost of break-even will dip, and I think somebody said earlier that 50 is a new 100. That's the direction we're going. We're not there yet, but that's where we're going to go, and that's deeply disruptive and beneficial to the United States.
Let me get back to the overall question I want to ask you, and then I'm going to ask each one of you to kind of address. We've got experts from different parts of the energy resource mix in the United States here. Get back to the original sort of premise, and these three things that we think that are really critical questions for the American populace and for our long-term future, the economy, national security, and the environment. If you as business and thought, and this is kind of an overall question, we don't have to answer it right now, but I'm going to come back to this at the end. So if you as thought leaders, as business leaders in this country, based on all your experience, were able to design a strategy. All of us have been involved in business. You have strategies. You have strategies. I mean, if without a strategy, and hope is not a strategy. Prayer for higher prices is not a strategy. I'm talking about business strategies we're all familiar with. If we had a strategy for energy, what would it look like to make the highest impact on the things we just talked about? And we'll come back to that. Let me go now to Mark Snell. Mark is power sector. Mark, you see lots of different, applications. I mean, the power sector is huge all over the world. It's growing. You've seen it because you've expanded outside the United States. How do you see the design the most affordable and effective framework for U.S. energy, and what's the role of natural gas?
It's a good question. As an operator of two of the largest utilities in California, I'm not sure lowest cost is really something that I can speak to with a lot of authority. But I can tell you that I think the idea of sort of an all of the above mix is somewhat here to stay for a while, and that includes coal at some point. But there's definitely a movement within the generation side towards gas and towards natural gas. It's going to be the predominant producer of electricity in the United States shortly, and it is definitely certainly in California, it is the only fossil fuel really that's being used in any extent. Nuclear is going to continue to play a mix in our electrical usage, but it's going to be very difficult to build new plants. I think they're pretty much off the table for California because of the seismic activity and the experience that we had at San Onofre, which we were a small part of. But so I think what we're going to see there is while nuclear around the world will expand, it'll be tough in the U.S. and very tough in certain parts of the U.S. And then renewables. Renewables is the fastest growing part of the energy sector, and I guess that helps when you start at zero. So it's always good to start small, and you can be a very fast grower. We are a big developer on both wind and the solar side, but solar has taken a big piece of the market share in California. One of the things that you're going to see across the country, and we see this in California since really 2008, since the recession, the electric use or electricity sales in the U.S. have actually declined every year. That's a remarkable outcome for a country that's so developed and so dependent upon energy. And a big chunk of it has been the recession. Obviously, that's taken a lot of the industrial load. But I think the other big part of it has been, as in our service territories, has been rooftop solar, which gets netted into that, and that's taken a chunk out of it. And we've had to really learn to adapt to do this. But I will say, it is not, you hear the dire predictions that if we go to a certain percentage of renewables or intermittent power, as we call it, that it'll cause grids to be destabilized, and you could have all kinds of problems. We really haven't seen that happen. We set a goal of 20%, and I would say to a person, all the major utilities said, boy, at 20%, that's really pushing it. We're now at 32% in California, and we haven't really had any kind of disruptions or problems. If you have a healthy grid, if you have a big interconnected grid, you can actually handle a lot of renewables. We see the number now of potential is somewhere around 50%. I don't know if it gets quite to 50, but we'll probably be there within the next 5 to 10 years in California. And so it's doable if you have the right infrastructure. And that's the biggest thing that we see coming, and it's probably the new thing in developed countries is a trend towards bigger grids, bigger ISOs, independent system operators. You're going to see it in the West Coast. Oregon is looking to join the Cal ISO. Washington may join as well. There'll be some restrictions on how all that works, but I think you're going to start to see bigger and bigger grids, which allows us to have a better energy mix going forward.
Good, thank you. Before I'm going to come to you next, or Hal on coal, but I want to ask a question, maybe of Mark. As we look at the energy mix and how the energy mix is going, both for power and transportation sector is still mostly, there's a little moving in of CNG, but and that'll be something that may go on certainly, but. One of the things is we look at the things that have driven sort of I see as the course and direction of policy in the United States in recent years has been the conclusion that we're facing an irreversible and apocalyptic global environmental crisis due to climate change that is largely human influence. The regulations and the body of regulations that have been imposed for this have huge societal costs and will continue to have that if we stay on that course. And yet, I think that alone has driven, the course of regulation and policy. It has overcome the sort of direction of people's thinking about what should be in our energy mix, and it's aided to demonize the oil and gas foundation, which has been the core of our energy mix and will be going forward in many, many ways and for a long time, because we're not going to run out of either one. So, Mark, from your perspective, what's missing in the dialogue here? And anybody that sort of comes out is sort of criticized and burned at the stake, for being agnostic about or for criticizing sort of this conclusion that we're on this course that's irreversible. It's a big world out there, for one thing. We've got, when I was 10 years old, I think the population of the world was 3.5 billion people or something like that, 7.5 billion people now. A lot of those people live, and as my friend Bob Shepard has pointed out, it's an inconvenient truth. But the reality is that there's 7.5 billion people in the world. Many of them are in developing countries. 1 billion people still don't have electricity. 2 billion people still living in mass poverty. They're going to be depending on the lowest sources of energy available in the food chain to contribute to this global thing. So here we're a country of 300 million people. Being realistic about what we can do and should do ought to enter the equation. And I think the role of technology and the evolution of our energy mix, the energy efficiency of that energy mix, the cleanliness of that energy mix is underestimated and not properly talked about. And this is just an observation I've got, but would you care to comment on that, Mark?
Okay, I'll start. I think, for the most part, the energy mix in this country is moving towards a cleaner output. There's no question about that. The move to natural gas will go a long ways to doing that. And I also think, too, that it doesn't have to be, we don't have to put ourselves at an economic disadvantage to have a relatively clean burning, electric production and energy mix. As I said, we've seen this drop in energy usage across our service territories and across the western states. And I think what's really interesting, though, is one of the big saviors for electric utilities will be electric cars, electric vehicles. If we get any kind of penetration, because it will charge at night, there's not a lot of infrastructure you have to add to really handle that. And each electric car is about, we think of them as half a house. It has about the same load as half a house. And so if you could get that half a house all to charge at between midnight and 5 a.m., you don't really have to do much to take care of that, and there's lots of ways to incentivize that. So I think there's some things there that are coming that will speak to that. But I think generally speaking, what most people have to recognize too is that the political landscape for the energy industry is changing. There are real headwinds to expansion of fossil fuels in the developed world. The developing countries are going to continue to do this because it's the quickest way to bring them out of poverty, as we just talked earlier, the earlier panel talked about China. And I don't see any way that the United States can stop that or should stop that. But what you're seeing in the developed world is a forced balance of renewables and cleaner burning fuels. And I think what you're seeing, in fact, I can tell you what California is doing, which is probably, you might be surprised, but maybe not because it is California. There is really a movement within the air quality management districts in California and the Air Resources Board to stop the burning of any fossil fuel. They would like to, what they call it is electrify the state. They would like to eliminate combustion at every spot that you can. No more gas-powered water heaters, no more gas stoves. They would like to see all electric heat. They would like to see all electric cars. These are all things that are massively expensive to do and difficult, but that is definitely the trend that they're moving towards, and it's becoming reinforced in policy all the time. And most of this stuff, it starts on the West Coast, it moves to the East Coast, and then it kind of comes to the middle of the country over time. So I do think you're going to see a movement towards that more and more. It's good for electric utilities, so we're not, but it's not good for our gas business. It's not good for our gas distribution business. Even though replacing all those BTUs at the burner tip will require more gas actually to generate the electricity in power plants, that's not usually a place where the distribution companies make their money. So it'll be an interesting shakeout of how all of that happens. I think the good news is it'll take many years, but it's definitely a trend.
Okay, Mark, you want to make any comments on that question?
Well, the elephant in the room is always climate change when you talk about energy in any venue, because if you don't address it, somebody will invariably ask about it. There's two things I would note, because you don't have to have an opinion on how strongly you believe in the apocalyptic models versus the moderate models for whether or not human beings are having a catastrophic or minor effect on the planet's atmosphere. It's obviously humans are having an effect because there's a lot of humans in the world burning lots of hydrocarbons. The debate in the scientific community, which is colleagues that many who I know have been studying this for decades, is over the magnitude of the effect and its urgency, which gets translated politically into apocalypse versus no apocalypse. So I would note a couple things, not to criticize California, but as California goes, sometimes the nation doesn't go, because California is, the great experiment of we have 50 states that try things. And California is typically on the edge of a lot of things, which makes it an exciting market. As a venture guy, many of the business deals I look at that are in energy tech that start in California, what you discover is when you model their opportunity to go outside of California is very difficult, because they have a very favorable subsidy and tax environment, which other countries do too. Here's the facts that one should have in mind. The world consumes oil primarily for transportation. In 1973, when the oil embargo happened, it sort of set the modern age. 30% of the world's oil was used in transportation. The rest was used in power generation and feedstocks. Today, it's almost 70% of world oil is used in transportation. and we use more oil, not less. Today in the world, there are 3 trillion passenger air miles flown annually and 10 trillion passenger road miles driven annually. Those numbers will double in the next 20 years or roughly, give or take, depends how growth goes. Even if you are a wildly enthusiastic believer in electric cars and half of all that demand on road miles is met with electric cars, which I don't believe for a minute, but that would be an astonishing increase in Teslas. I mean, this would fall into a sort of Tesla derangement syndrome belief set. Not a California derangement syndrome, just a Tesla derangement syndrome. I like Teslas, but there aren't could be that many Tesla-class cars in the world. That still means 50% more oil demand for transportation. Those two markets each, the growth in those two markets alone represent 10 million barrels per day of new demand for oil, for airplanes and cars. Most cars and trucks will be oil-fired for the next 20 to 50 years. Almost all airplanes will be oil-fired, 99.9%. They're 100% today. They'll be 99% oil-fired. In fact, even if you're really a techno-optimist, which I am, and you think we'll wring efficiencies out of the transportation market by invoking drones, and you pick up 5% of first and last mile with drones to add efficiencies to markets, which UPS, FedEx, and Amazon famously say they want to do, because of the inconvenient physics of the planet we live on, gravity and stuff like that. If you do the arithmetic on that, the 5% of the transport of existing goods in the United States going to drones would increase the energy used in transportation by 50% in the United States. So I don't think that'll happen. Those drones will be oil-fired, by the way, not battery-powered, because you can't carry heavy stuff on a laptop battery flying in the air. You're going to have a Predator-class drone, which burns oil. It's got a snowmobile, 100-horsepower oil-burning snowmobile engine in it, as you probably know. So what I would end with is I invoke, when I talk about climate change, what I now call the Gates imperative. Bill Gates gave a very lengthy interview in Atlantic Monthly at the end of last year. If you haven't read it, just Google up Gates Atlantic Monthly interview, in which he concluded something which I've concluded years ago, and it's nice to have somebody who's the richest man in the world, therefore the smartest guy in the world, agree with you. There's a one-to-one correlation on wealth and smarts. We all know this. I'm working up there, but most of the guys here are smarter than me, I think, by definition. Gates has concluded that there are no technologies and no subsidies that exist today that can replace hydrocarbons at the scale the world needs. Period. Full stop. He's not saying he doesn't support subsidies. He said there's simply no technology available. Period. Google did the same thing. Google started a big program called RLS&C. Remember that? Renewables cheaper than coal. And they funded this program. They canceled it 18 months, 2 years ago. The two lead engineers wrote a lengthy piece in the IEEE Spectrum, it's an engineering journal, in which they said the same thing. And I can give you exactly what they included. The technologies don't exist today to meet our goal. The technologies don't exist, and the science doesn't exist. So Gates is pushing a big R&D program to find new magic science, what I would like to call the pursuit of unobtainium. What he wants, and he says this in his words, the world will need twice as much energy in the future, not less, even with efficiency. Efficiency drives demand, doesn't kill it. It will need to be half the price in order to meet the economic goals of the world. That's what he believes. Twice as much energy at half the price. There's no way to do that without hydrocarbons, full stop. So there will be more hydrocarbons produced in the future, not fewer. It doesn't matter whether you believe the climate is facing an apocalypse or not. If you believe it is, then you would engage in mitigation and adaptation. You wouldn't destroy the world's economy.
Let's go to Hal Quinn. Hal, speaking of environmental issues and hot buttons, let's talk about coal. How do you envision the role of coal in a sensibly balanced, all of the above strategy for the United States or policy, whatever you're going to call it? How do you envision the role of coal from your perspective?
Let's talk first about the performance in terms of delivering power reliably, affordably in terms of coal's history. So we have coal's generation capacity is about 25% of the entire electric power grid right now. But it delivers anywhere from 38 to 40%. It's probably a little bit under that now, and at one time, 50% of our electric power. So obviously, we have a source that can scale easily, scales affordably, scales reliably. There's an incredible infrastructure built around actually not only producing the coal but delivering it throughout the United States. Now, on the environmental side, this has been one of the biggest critiques of coal. Since coal has been thrust to be the forefront, the workhorse of our electricity system, our grid since the 1970s, the coal use is increased by 90%. But at the same time, because of technology and investments, the actual emissions of criteria emissions has actually dropped over 92%. So you see on two scales, you see economic dividends with the reliability, low cost, and you see environmental dividends with technology development. Now, back to the point about climate change and carbon. So I think Mark Mills makes a great point about, let's do the math and what Bill Gates has had to say. And Bill Gates is not the only one who's of note that has concluded that at this point in time, trying to do something differently might be actually create a less sustainable political and otherwise environment globally. But the fact is, I still believe that in terms of coal, but also hydrocarbons generally, the solution is ultimately going to be technology. And it's going to be expensive for a while, but it's going to be carbon abatement technologies. And it's just not a coal issue. So we have policies right now in the United States that are all about addressing what I would say carbon concerns in a very symbolic but very expensive way. They're all about substitution. So we're seeing thrust to substitute renewables for fossils, and then within fossils, gas for coal. But if you do the math there, it doesn't really make any difference in the end, because even with the models that people rely on, they're not going to, just in the United States for certain, it won't materially change the trajectory of carbon emissions. So if you really want to go full in on this, you're really going to have to put, you don't even have to put, I don't think, the same amount of over $1 trillion that we've done for renewables over the last 25 years. And we've only spent probably 13 to 15 billion on carbon capture and storage. But if you go full in on the abatement technologies, there's two steps. For coal, there's two steps. There's a high efficiency, low emissions technology for boilers that can get 15 to 35% efficiency improvements. So all emissions, including carbon, goes down depending on the age and efficiency of the plant it will eventually replace, whether it's the United States or somewhere else. And the second part is those same high efficiency, low emissions boiler technologies are going to be the platforms for deployment, making it potentially more affordable to implement the carbon abatement technologies of capture, reuse, or storage. But in the end, it's not really a coal issue. It's really a fossil fuel issue. You're going to have to adapt these types of technologies across the board, whether it's natural gas, it's oil, it's petrochemicals, and other high carbon industrial pieces. So my point is that a lot of here in the United States, we have policies that are all about substitution, but at scale, they all have limitations, whether it's scale, deliverability, price, and so forth. And if we're really if we're really interested in dealing with the climate issue, then we'd have to, I think, again, go back to what has proven to work in the past for our entire country, but also our entire industries, which is technology development. And a lot of it's not basic R&D. It's really going to be applied research. It's applied engineering, because a lot of these technologies have been around. It's a matter of just going from demonstration to commercial scale.
You mentioned coal's been kind of the workhorse and sort of, I call it the long-term safety net. I'm an oil and gas guy, so I think in terms of reserves. And I understand reserves of oil and gas and potential, recoverable reserves from oil and gas in the hydrocarbon sector. But what is your perspective on the reserve potential? How much do we have left? High quality coal. Coal.
Hey, Mark, I'm gonna take your job next, I think. Well, here in the United States, it's we have the most of what everybody wants and needs. So we have 27% of the resource in the world for coal alone. The next in line is China or Russia. But they're even far behind, but double digits. So we have incredible amounts, and we've had the technology, just as the oil and gas with shale technology really took off. It's been probably 20 to 30 years ago where the coal industry in the United States started deploying larger scale extraction methods, whether it's for surface mining in the West or higher efficiency, fuller extraction underground technologies that really brought the productivity to the point where you had the price drops in terms of delivered power prices. So we have plenty here. I think what's amazing when I listened to the panel this morning, I think if I had to sum it up, it's basically, well, we have abundance that gives us a lot of optionality as a country, and optionality brings you a lot of opportunities, whether it's economic and geopolitical and others. My biggest fear here is when we had these questions about policy, energy policy, is the last thing we probably need is the government coming in and trying to tell us how do we do that. And usually, even when most of our energy policies are an outgrowth of crisis, and they're usually lagging in terms of figuring out what's really needs to be addressed ahead of the time. So you have policies that lock in, we find out they're no longer needed, they're really tough to undo. And so you have a lot of capital misallocation and other decisions being made. So I caution against having the government try to, and I've worked on the 1992 Energy Policy Act, the 2005, the 2007. I'm not sure in any of those it did anything tremendous for the hydrocarbon industry. There was a lot of issues about substitution and efficiency, which are all good things, but I'm not sure that at this point in time the government, I think it was one of the panels on the first panel said, best thing to do is let them stay out of our way, and I think a lot of things can be accomplished.
Good point. Let's talk about public enemy number 2 in the environmental sort of, and that's oil and gas. And let me turn it over to Scott. Scott, I was living outside the country when the shale revolution really hit. I was living in Europe or England, and you read about it peripherally, but I came back in 2009, 2010, and just blown away by what was going on. And you and you weren't around. None of us were around when maybe John Brock was around when we went from cable tool drilling to rotary drilling, right? You might have been, but the technological innovation that happened to create this ability, both from a mechanical engineering point of view, electrical engineering point of view, to be able to geosteer a rotational torsion, and translate that into a lateral that can keep it in a pay zone for for a mile or two is just phenomenal. This has been a game changer, and I tell people that don't know about oil and gas and don't really understand reservoir mechanisms, I said, what we're doing, we're sort of mining the source rock of the they're still sourcing the shallower reservoirs that we produce for decades. So we're accelerating that through this mining process, in effect. But we're doing it very economically. We're continuing the learning curve has been huge. As I look back at the rate of decline we were on before this happened, and if I do, like a reservoir engineer I could draw a decline curve, and we would be producing less than 4 million barrels a day on that decline curve had it not happened. Now we're 9.5 or 10. We've been at 10, I guess. So it's a game changer. It's been a game changer for our country, for the world. How long can this last? And how do you see it going? And why are we not doing a good enough? Why is this still public enemy number 2 in the big picture?
No, that's something also I've thought a lot about. If you go back in time, it sort of starts with the number of when school books changed. It's when Al Gore, believe it or not, got his Oscar in 2006. And so studies have shown that I've got 2 grandkids in Carmel, and California is by far, I agree, the furthest to the left in getting rid of hydrocarbons. And those grandkids are being taught that hydrocarbons are bad. So I'm having to defend that. Not in the Texas schools yet. I've got grandkids in Texas schools, but it's coming. And so I've been very concerned about it. We were one of the founding members of the American Natural Gas Alliance. So when we found too much gas shale, started going to D.C. in 2009 and convinced people we have all this natural gas. It'll last for 200 years. And the first thing the environmental group started convincing everybody in Congress, in all three branches, that fracking is bad. And so I came from Amoco, so did you, where Amoco invented fracking back in the 1940s. And Pioneer's fracked probably almost as many wells as most companies, 10,000 wells we have fracked. There never has been any contamination with any freshwater zones. And so everybody, Gasland came out one, Gasland 2 came out during this last 5, 6, 7 years. A lot of it was proven to be false. And so it took us 2 years, and probably the EPA didn't come out until 2014, 15, that fracking is safe. So it took us 4 to 5 years to convince them that fracking is safe. We had Macondo happen in that time frame. And so we started getting challenging with cement jobs, basically, based on what happened in Macondo. And so we wasted a lot of time and effort. That's why it took us so long to convince them. It took them forever to convince them. It took forever to convince the utility companies. Because if you remember in the 80s, in the 90s, we said we had lots of gas, but then all of a sudden you sold $9 gas. And then going into the export ban, spending the last 2 years, 3 years, and trying to convince everybody. There has been a movement from a positive standpoint from the Obama administration that they understand national security. They understood that we added 4.5 million barrels a day. When Pioneer, if you remember, was the first company to export condensate in 2014. So we went to the Commerce Department and found a way to redefine crude oil. You and I know that condensate is oil, but we went to the Commerce Department, convinced them it wasn't oil. It was processed. Okay, so we were the first company to process, or actually to export condensate in 2014, and then we went on a 2-year battle. But I've seen movement. They understand 4.5 million barrels a day. I can promise you, going from 4.5 million barrels a day to 9.6, 9.7 was a tremendous benefit. So I think we've made efforts on Congress. We made efforts on the president. Most people told us we would never get the export ban lifted. He signed it. We had to trade. I knew we were going to have to trade a year ago. I met with several Democratic senators, and I do believe we need to have alternative energy. It's more expensive. Solar and wind, we had to extend the tax credits out to 2020, 2022, 2019, depending on which form. So we extended those tax credits. It is more expensive, but we need to do it. But we're making effort. Now, the American public is a separate issue. The American public, if you read Alex Epstein's book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, which is a very good book, it talks about the benefit of low-price hydrocarbons, what we've done for the world, the 7.5 billion people, the 2 billion people we're not providing energy for. It's a very good book, but we need more people like that outside the industry to do a better job in the benefits of hydrocarbons in this country. And on the resource question, we do have both gas and oil, lots of resource left.
Good. Rusty, we talked this morning about gas and gas's role in a global context too, not just in the United States, but I want to talk about how you see natural gas globally and our ability, because of what we've done, because of the shale revolution, because of the resource potential in natural gas in the United States, and it maybe extend that into what the resource potential is in our neighbors, which we don't, geopolitically, we don't think about much, but Canada and Mexico. And I'm going to come back to this subject again, but this is a powerhouse to me in terms of resource potential for natural gas. I'm long-term resource potential for natural gas between the three countries, and if you look at it, they're our closest neighbors, probably should be our closest friends geopolitically. How do you see, there was a lot of talk about natural LNG, and we know it's going to be a rocky road because the world is awash with natural gas, but in terms of the cost of putting LNG in the market, our ability, are we doing all we can there?
Well, just to take it up to the higher level, the natural gas resource, as we've talked about, is extremely large in the United States. We can produce gas very cheaply. And there's another aspect to this that I don't think we've talked much about, and that's the fact that to some extent, there's a sizable part of the natural gas production in the United States that's basically viewed as a byproduct. It certainly was when crude oil prices were high. If we get crude oil prices high again, both crude oil and natural gas liquids, propane and butane, that tend to be priced more aligned with crude oil than they do natural gas, encourage producers like Scott to go out and drill for crude, which comes along with associated gas, which drills for wet gas that comes along with residue gas, and both of those things increase the amount of production in the United States. So to the extent that we can tap that resource, effectively a byproduct resource for a non-trivial amount of our production, and get that resource to neighboring countries like Mexico where we can supply by pipeline, that is a good thing. I don't think the Canadians would say they need a lot of our gas right now, but we're taking a lot less of their gas because of our resource base here. I'm a little less enthusiastic or maybe optimistic than Mark is about LNG. LNG terminals cost an awful lot of money. And to the extent that if you believe this cyclical price of crude oil that I think we've inferred and talked a lot about, where crude oil prices, or if they do go up, then eventually producers like Scott will come back into the market and push the price right back down. We have lots of other producers in the world that could do the same. We could very well be dealing with a relatively cyclical, maybe volatile is not the right word to put on it, but at least cyclical price of crude oil. Well, let's face it, the price of LNG in world markets tends to be fairly well determined by the price of crude oil in world markets. It's not a 100% relationship, and it'll certainly change over time. But cheaper crude, when cheaper crude hits the marketplace, you're going to have less of an economic incentive to export natural gas out of the United States, no matter how cheap it gets, on the presumption that it's not going to get so cheap that it doesn't make any sense to drill for it anymore. So getting natural gas as a resource to our neighboring countries makes a lot of sense. Getting natural gas and turning out to be, I forget what number you had, like a 30 BCF, getting at eventually 8 BCF, absolutely, maybe 10, 12, I would even buy that. But getting much more than that number, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult thing. Now, what does that do to the world balance on gas? Well, we're going to be pushing a lot of gas back into the market, just like we pushed crude back into the market as our crude oil production increased, and that will put downward pressure on global LNG, and that is a good thing, I think, for the United States and for our market share. It's not necessarily a good thing for your latter question of, does it make sense for a lot of the rest of the world to use the kind of technologies that we've developed in order to go produce gas in the rest of the world? We're going to have a surplus. We're going to have a surplus for a long time, and I think most people accept that fact, and therefore ponying up a lot more money for LNG export facility is going to be a hard row to hoe in this environment.
Okay. Let's talk about, while we're talking about gas, there's been a lot of discussion. How will the shale revolution, how will our technology be exported, and is that another layer in the supply glut internationally with oil and for gas? Scott, how do you see that?
Yes, Pioneer was overseas for about 15 years. And one thing we've learned around the world, that the cost of drilling a well onshore in other countries is about 3 times as much. And you don't have the amount of service companies. You have 2. You're going to have 2 once these other mergers complete. You'll have 2 choices of 2 companies in most countries around the world to use, Halliburton or Schlumberger. They have huge pricing power. If you look at their revenue statements, most of their power, their financial revenues is from overseas. So you got to start with that premise. Argentina is one of the few examples where it's working because they have artificial prices. They have $67 oil. We were in Argentina for 12 years. We got out in 2006. The administration has changed, but they're incentivizing by giving higher gas prices and higher oil prices, artificial, just to incentivize the rig count. So they got a fairly high rig count today. So that's unique but the rest of the world don't have the pipeline infrastructure. They can get the technology. China's tried it. In most basins, they have not found a lot. It's too expensive. Saudi Arabia, I know for a fact, they have made some monstrous gas shale wells recently. Their goal is to triple, quadruple their gas production over the next 10 years so they can export more oil. And that's the best way for them to export more oil, is to rely 100% solely on natural gas. So I do not think the rest of the world is going to, they have the potential geologically. There's other factors politically, resource-wise, lack of infrastructure is going to keep them from moving. It'll be very, very slow process.
Land position, too.
Land, yes.
Yeah.
We have the most unique land position in the world. It's the only place in the world that you have private mineral owners.
Let's go back, before we open it up for questions from the audience, let's go back to the question I posed in the beginning. And I will start by saying, I agree that we don't need more policy if policy just tries to guide us in how we're going to run our business. I look at, as I look at our so-called policy today, it's a stack of regulations that have changed depending on who's in power in Washington and their emphasis. But getting back to this idea of having a strategy for our energy, okay, let's say that we all accept that a reasonable, balanced, all of the above strategy sounds good. We've got the resources. We're blessed with tremendous resources in the United States and North America. We're faced with lots of issues, economic issues, growth issues, things companies hate when they're making investments to grow businesses, their volatility. How does reasonably low-cost energy resource from a variety of sources help us to grow our economy with less volatility? How does our strength and energy resource potential change our position with respect to geopolitical actions that we take, policies and strategies that we take? And then how does that translate into a better environment for us? So if you're thinking about a strategy as a business person, how would you define a strategy going forward for our country that goes beyond 4 years and 4-year cycles that we typically have in politics? Anybody want to start that one?
I'll start it, Bruce. I mean, obviously, we need to have a government or a policy to allow our industry to really grow and bring forward our gas reserves and oil reserves. An example we're fighting now, that I've been fighting for about 5-6 years, is methane emissions. I do believe that we should capture all the escape gas around a tank battery or after a frac job. But one of the things I fought for is not to get so far down the road on stripper wells. Oklahoma and Texas has the most stripper wells in the country. And so these recent rules, proposals, which could go into effect by the time Obama leaves office, we're installing a vapor recovery unit on every horizontal well now that we drill, and I think we should. It's economical, but now the new rules are going to want you to, on a 1 barrel a day oil well that makes 3 MCF a day, they want you to install a $50,000 vapor recovery unit. And those are the type of things we need to get the entire government out of the picture. The industry does a great job. We do make mistakes occasionally, like Macondo, but the industry is a technological leader. We do a great job, and we understand the environment is very important for us. They just need to let the industry go and let us produce these oil and gas, these great quantities that we have, and export them around the world.
Thoughtful regulation, not carte blanche.
Exactly.
Well, the United States does have a form of energy policy, and it's a policy to throttle the oil and gas industry. And I don't mean that facetiously, because the regulations that Scott's talking about are typical of this. We don't have, and we probably never will have, an Argentina type of structure in America, which is a good thing. The previous panelists have talked about it. We don't set the price of oil at $67 a barrel. High five, we're back into the Bakken, right? I mean, it's great. And the scoop opens up big time in Oklahoma. That's not going to happen. But what we are doing is making it difficult for the industry to function, affirmatively difficult. So the Bureau of Land Management Policies, for example, is one example. Every other country of the world, most of the oil and gas resources are controlled by the nation state, and the nation state encourages production on their national land. Here we discourage it. By every possible measure. In fact, Obama just reversed the offshore lease program. It takes anywhere from 300 to 600 days to get a permit on BLM land, and depending on the state you're in, 30 to 60 days, I think, to get permits on state private land. These are energy policies. They are anti-development energy policies which throttle the industry. The time it takes to get permits of any kind, the addition of new classes of permits. It's not very sexy to say in a political sphere, we got to clean up the regulatory environment. It's just not. I think it is possible for a politician to construct the arguments intelligently around, we'll call it 21st century smart regulations that can achieve the goals everybody wants to create jobs. So it's a job creation program. The other energy policy we have is actually a tax policy in this sense. Large corporations don't pay much in the way of taxes. They just don't. And some of them pay zero. Small corporations pay the high marginal tax rate. The 30% plus tax marginal rate is paid by small corporations. The oil and gas industry in America is dominated numerically by small corporations. The reason there's no service businesses to help Argentina, other than Halliburton and for now Baker and Schlumberger, is that the thousands that exist, boutique firms, don't exist there. They're here. But they pay high marginal taxes. And the only people that pay corporate taxes are consumers. So a good government energy policy would be to have either reduce corporate taxes to 10% or zero, because that will create jobs and profits in the whole ecosystem of the thousands of businesses, because they'll be able to make a profit at a lower prices. By definition, 30% is a lot. The other tax policy, which is affirmatively anti-energy, is, of course, the repatriation of foreign corporate profits. No other nation does what we do, which is double tax foreign corporate profits. Large corporations, in particular, in the oil and gas sector, the industrial sector broadly, the United States has $600 billion of profits parked overseas. Easily, I think, half of that would come home if you give it a tax holiday and invest here, which would, again, create jobs. And I'm talking not about the tech sector's foreign profits. That's another $700 billion. There's $2 trillion sitting overseas. If those profits came home and built factories here, they'd be natural gas consuming factories. They would be electricity consuming factories. They would be job creating factories. So there is a policy, and the policy is actually consistent with American philosophy, which is lighter intelligent regulation and lower intelligent taxes. If you did those things, it would stimulate a phenomenal, I think, resurgence in U.S. Infrastructure construction, oil and gas in particular.
Rusty? Oh, go ahead, Hal.
Bruce, I was just going to make a comment on just from the electricity sector. And it's not so much long-term policies. I think it's near-term needs. And since electricity is a good part of our energy portfolio. First, I think one of the questions I think is emerging is that the current policies and market designs do not fully value diversity in our grid. And what's the value of that? I mean, IHS Energy did a analysis a couple of years ago and looked at the diversity of our electric grid with coal, nuclear, gas, and renewables, and found that because of that diversity, it saves American consumers $93 billion. It's $93 billion a year. And then we talked about volatility earlier, and it reduces the volatility of the utility bills by 30%, and maybe in some regions it could be higher depending on their fuel mix. So the current markets have a design, plus there's policies that are shifting things that are valuing each kilowatt hour almost the same, even though they have different attributes. So when somebody bids in demand side management, that is what I call phantom watts, they're going to get the same amount in the end if they clear the market price as the person who's running a nuclear or coal baseload plant that's going to go 24/7. Same with maybe other non-firm sources. So I think that's an issue, and it's really confronting nuclear today in terms of the retirements, and to some extent coal. And then you have your other policies that promote some of these other sources. So that's one thing that probably needs some attention in the near term. I think Mark has said that the grid is capable of handling higher penetration of renewables, and he's the expert, so I'm going to accept that. But I think there's a transition issue there. But the next transition issue I think that we ought to talk about in terms of electricity sector is the infrastructure. So our analysis indicates that probably because of EPA and other policies that are putting pressure on coal plants, that 90% of the replacement capacity is going to be natural gas. And I think there's real, and then I think EPA is hoping for a higher penetration of renewable, but either way, I think there's a real question whether we can get that infrastructure needed to deliver that product to the new plants done in a timely manner during this transition. And I don't think that's been accounted for. And I realize, I think Mark can identify with this. I mean, I identify with my members when we're trying to put in a new mine, and I mean a copper mine or anything like that. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of time. I mean, we have one of the worst permitting systems in the world, when it comes to mining. We have a world-class resource base, but a third world, permitting system. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty there in terms of pipelines, transmission, and so forth. And when you have to have it, so we can have the supply, but if we don't have the infrastructure to deliver it, that's going to be a major problem.
I want to come back. Go ahead, Rusty. You want to go ahead?
Well,
No, go ahead.
far away.
Go ahead.
Well, all I was going to say is I couldn't agree more about the diversity. I think we have to realize and accept the fact that the political momentum in the United States is shifting toward cleaner fuels, cleaner air, less hydrocarbons. And in terms of what kind of policy that we would have to put in place in order to be successful in that sort of environment, we've got to recognize that there's things that we have to do in order to clean up hydrocarbon emissions that are going to be expensive. Scott, you're probably not going to like all of them. But as long as everybody got charged the same thing, in other words, it was a level playing field, I think all of us would be happy. I think Hal would be relatively happy about that if it was all the same playing field, is that we were all shooting for the same objective, and that is cleaner air, cleaner fuels, et cetera. To me, if we got realistic about that sort of energy policy in the United States, we'd all be better for it.
That's an excellent point. Mark?
Yeah, I'll make a couple comments on energy policy. So I think with respect to renewables, it is interesting that the crude oil export lifting of that ban came with it a price of increased or continued subsidies for renewables. And interestingly enough, a lot of the renewable developers, ourselves included, we lobbied pretty hard to actually end a lot of those policies. Because we think they create a imbalance of the wrong kind of technology in the wrong spots. Right now, wind for the most part can be competitive with gas-fired generation if it's sited in the right spot. What happens when you subsidize the wind production, you tend to build in marginal places where it's probably not as good a resource. And so I think that's an issue. Similarly with solar, while the ITC was going to drop down to 10%, and it still will over time, maybe the extension there will probably help that industry a little bit. But again, we're seeing such dramatic drops in panel prices that we think that you're not going to get to grid parity. And that's that's not going to happen, but you are going to get to a cheaper price over time, and the subsidies become less important. For us, what we like to see, the renewable standards that the utilities have to follow, whether even if you had a national standard of 15%, which would be relatively modest, that allows each individual area to build what works best for their constituents, and whether that's wind or solar or geothermal or whatever, those kinds of things are better. And I think as to the level playing field, one of the reasons that California was able to go so far to have such a high percentage of renewables is because all of you in this room paid for it. And so the rest of the country subsidized the actions of a particular part. Now, there was a trade-off. California also bought renewables at a much higher price because the prices have continued to come down, and so they've paid some of that price as well. But it was spread across the entire United States because those tax subsidies were federal. And so at the end of the day, I think, where we kind of locate the best resource in the best place, and whether that's gas or coal or renewables, that in and of itself will be the most logical outcome and probably the best outcome for the consumer. And then I just want to say one last thing on LNG, because obviously, and I think Rusty and I are in violent agreement on probably the amount that's going to be exported. But one of the things that I wanted to mention, there is a reason and why U.S. LNG is actually more desirable in a lot of ways than LNG produced anywhere else in the world. And it's a couple of things. One is obviously the rule of law here and the amount that you can count on if you sign a contract with a U.S. company to do this, that it'll be enforced and it'll be deliverable, and those are very, very strong arguments for doing business in the U.S. But the other one, which is just a function, we will be the only LNG producing country in the world that has a significant local demand. And what that does is that gives the LNG purchaser an incredible amount of optionality that they don't have anywhere else in the world. If you're buying from the Qataris and you don't want that LNG or you don't need it, you got to find some place to put it. If you're buying from the Australians, it's the same thing. You're also committing. LNG is a relatively small club, and it is built on long-term contracts that you don't abrogate if you want to do another LNG deal. And at the end of the day, if you're signed up with Australia, you're going to pay for that infrastructure from the wellhead all the way to the ship. In the U.S., you really are only committing to the liquefaction facility, which is a fraction of the total overall cost. It's about $3 roughly. And when you do that, if you don't need the gas, if you've committed to buy gas, you can sell it in the local market. If you've signed up for pipeline capacity, you can release it into the local market. You can mitigate a huge amount of your risk with U.S. LNG that you cannot mitigate anywhere else in the world. That's very, very attractive to customers, and the fact that it's priced off of Henry Hub or NYMEX compared to the crude oil cocktail price that's been the tradition for LNG, that's also very attractive to get a different pricing mix into their portfolio. It's never going to be the dominant mix, but every LNG user that we've talked to has been interested in diversifying their pricing portfolio by getting a NYMEX or Henry Hub based price. So I think the reality is that, again, this is a long-term contracted business. The next big contract expirations don't happen until 2025, 24. So we're not going to see big volumes, big volumes come available until then. But when they do, I think the U.S. will play a predominant role in filling some of those volumes.
Thanks, Mark. I want to open it up for questions from the audience, and I'll also include the panelists on the first panel if they want to make any comments on what was discussed here. So let's open it up to questions from the audience. Anybody? There's a couple back here, one on the top, one over here. Okay. Do you see there's one right up here in the middle of the third or fourth row up?
Thank you. Thank you. My question is for Scott. You indicated earlier that the collective debt on oil company balance sheets is roughly $550 billion today. I'm curious, in this pricing environment, what is the collective value of the asset base on that debt?
At this price is probably not that much higher, so sad to say. So not much higher at the current strip, which is 45 next year, goes up $1 per year to, we don't get to $50 till 2020, 21. So.
Other questions? I think we had one over here. Fourth row, over here in the middle. Right here. Raise your hand high.
Yeah, sorry. Gotta rinse it.
So this may be a little off topic, but Scott, you mentioned your grandkids out in California. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so you mentioned your grandkids out in California and the kind of the rhetoric out there. And my question is that I'm noticing from my friends that don't live in Oklahoma or Texas, and even my wife included, how can you go about changing the public perception that could influence politics? Because I feel like that's a pretty big issue. So especially with my generation and the younger generation, to let them understand that we need to have a good balance between not only renewables but also fossil fuels.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've thought about that, and there's no easy answer. It goes back, my research shows it goes back to oil is about the price of gasoline we see every day. So think of any other thing that we use in our home or whatever. The price of electricity we see once a month. Most of us are online, electric bills. You never see the price of electricity. The price of gasoline has been posted for the last 70, 80, 90 years. And so it's something we see every day. And so there's a perception still today, even though independents drill 95% of the wells in this country, we're only down to two majors left in this country, and that's Exxon and Chevron that are U.S. based. Everybody else is diversified, and so the perception still in D.C., when we formed PACE, for instance, they told us do not allow Exxon and Chevron to join your organization. We do not want any major oil company here talking to us. That's why API has a different image. API does a great job, but our industry has been too fractionated. You have IPAA, the independent producers. You have API, which has historically been the majors, which is now a lot of independents. The independents now drill most of our wells, so we've never had the right messaging. Now, how to change that? You need to get, when we formed PACE, we basically got 15 CEOs in the room, and we formed ANGA, we got 15, 20 CEOs in the room, and we committed as CEOs to participate to increase natural gas demand and convince everybody we have a tremendous supply. So you basically got to get top 15, 20, 30, 40 CEOs in a room and hit this messaging, and we just haven't done that. You have API with their messages, you have IPAA with their messages, and we're still not, I think it's gone too far myself, sad to say, in states like California. Other states up in the Northeast have banned fracking. It's gone too far. You need somebody, a group of people 100% dedicated with funds to really change that entire image. But so we're making progress, but I don't see how we can go backwards.
Dave, did you want to? Any other questions out there? Yeah, we do. We got a couple. Okay, up here.
Me? This is for Mr. Brazil, I believe. We utilize about 18 million barrels of crude and condensate. We produce 9 million. The other 9 million being imported is mainly heavy oil and sour oil. Why don't our refineries that converted about 35 years ago to use this imported heavy and sour oil, why don't they convert back to sweet oil, since we have the ability of producing that sweet oil with our horizontal wells now?
Just what they've been doing. They've been spending money to do just exactly that. They're running a lot more light sweet crudes now. And we developed a number of splitters, which are basically simple refineries, to do exactly the same thing. What happened 2 years ago was we had a serious quality imbalance problem. And I think that's part of what, Scott, when you start going to D.C. and talking to folks about getting the rules liberalized, well, we did three things. We changed the rules where we could export condensates. That got rid of some of the light material. We did some upgrades on refineries. That allowed refineries to absorb some of that material. And then we built those splitters, and that got rid of some of that material too. So in effect, a lot of that quality imbalance went away. And now that that exports were allowed, as of the first of this year, exports have been relatively meager in the volumes that have been going out of the United States, because a lot of that quality problem has gone away. In fact, any barrel that we export because we're net importers, exactly as you said, we're going to have to import another barrel to replace that barrel that exported, right? Want to guess who the organization is supplying the greatest number of those increased imports in order to be able to make up that balance? That'd be OPEC. That's precisely what's happened.
Okay. Question up here. Did you have a question? Yep.
Please, perhaps for Scott, you mentioned the Saudis are ramping up natural gas production. I'm with their exporting agricultural land, buying agricultural land. How does natural gas play into desalination plants, I wonder? Or is that so far off topic that we should
I don't know. I'm sure they're going to use natural gas for all their desalination plants too. So, but their goal is to export more crude oil, and they hope to be exporting it. They've been exporting historically about 7.5 million barrels a day, and so they're using internally about 2.5. And so they want to be able to export. That's the best way for them. They have huge gas reserves. And so the best way for them to export more crude oil in the future as we get into these swings and supply shocks where we need supply, Saudi Arabia is still going to have the most capacity. Secondly, probably the U.S. in regard to our shale basins to supply the world's supply.
I'm really wondering if anybody knows if lower natural gas prices would contribute to a better freshwater supply around the world.
Good point. Pass that down to. There was one question up here.
Yes. And I'm not sure who this is for, but in reference to price volatility, on the futures market, a lot more oil seems to be traded every month than we actually produce worldwide, and it seems that and I don't know how much of that volatility is due to that, but it would seem like that increased margin requirements, as were required in the stock market in the 1920s, would be one way to even out those curves, and I don't know if our $40 price environment is how much of that is due to the freedom of easy trade with futures, but I'm curious what you all think about that, whether we'd be at $40 regardless of whether we had tougher margin requirements or not.
My thinking is that we would have $40 irrespective of margin requirements, although I do think that the futures markets contribute to volatility. In other words, the $26 that we had, I think that was a lot of shorts piling on, and one of the reasons why prices came back up when after Ed noted the several things that happened in the market that created that impetus. Another one of those things that happened was a lot of shorts bailed out of the market just as soon as it became apparent that pressure was not going to be there anymore, and that's one of the things that got us to $40. Those guys have a lot of money. Increasing margin requirements a little bit, I don't think would make a darn bit of difference.
I would say that the futures market provides, I think, a needed liquidity in the market. And for every one of those shorts, there's somebody taking a long position at the other side of that deal. For a lot of oil and gas, actually without the futures market, I don't know that the shale revolution could have happened, because the financing that was required to do that, almost all of those producers had to hedge their production for some period of time in order to get that financing at a price that made all of this work. So we ran one of the largest commodity trading operations in the U.S. for a number of years, and during the financial crisis, we had to defend ourselves on a lot of this. And during the energy crisis in California in 2001, we had to defend our positions. But I think the economists that have looked at this and what we've seen from the trading side is the liquidity that's provided in the market through the futures market and through active trading comes with a net benefit, and a lot of that net benefit has to do with cheaper financing because you're able to hedge in the forward markets.
Good point. Got a question up here at the top.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, this is just a quick question. We talk about the anti-oil policies that the U.S. government has, and especially Scott mentioned about it took us 3 years to convince the EPA that fracking was good, and after Macondo, some of the cementing and a lot of the policies have shortchanged. My question is about seismic activity induced by water injection. How do you think that would affect especially Oklahoma and Texas outlook for the future? Do you think if the government put the hands on that, it will affect the oil industry?
I'll try to tackle it. As some of y'all know, we had the prior dean of the school here on our board, so he's educated me a lot, so I can't say a lot, but I can give you my general opinion in regard to Texas and Oklahoma. But in general, in fact, in Irving, what's interesting, we've had like 300 earthquakes in the last 4 years where I live, and Pioneer's headquarters is. Our geologist gave a full presentation, and there's not a disposal well probably within 50, 60 miles away. But what's happening is two geologic plates are moving underneath Irving. That's what's causing these mini earthquakes. That's one example. And then in regard to Johnson County, and then with Oklahoma, the certain plays up here, you're producing a lot more water. In the Eagle Ford, our water is vaporized. So at the depth that we are fracking with, the water at the temperatures, so we're producing no low water back. And what's interesting, in the Permian Basin, we're producing, you would think you would produce frack water back, your first barrel of water, Bruce. But we've done all these mapping studies of the type of water we're getting back. We're getting back formation water. But the water dissipates over time. But in Oklahoma, in certain plays up here, you got so much more water, and people are drilling disposal wells that eventually will lubricate a fault. And that's my general opinion of everything I've read. And we have to do a better job as an industry of relocating our disposal wells away from and using seismic and relocating our disposal wells in the future away from any major faults.
I think if we had a geologist on the panel, they would tell you that the tectonic plates of the earth are always moving, and that's something that's hard to predict and see. And you combine that with a massive fault system we've got going through central Oklahoma and splay faults and cumulative water injection in a new play that's been going for 8 years now. All the components, and some of them we can't do anything about. Some of them are, and a geologist, we'll do that. Say that for another time. I think we've got one more. I want one more question one more comment from Dave Gompel.
Time?
Yeah.
It has to do with renewables and what, if anything, we've learned over the last couple of years. It used to be that you'd think that renewables were not economic. That is, the research, the development, and everything follows was not economic below a certain price of hydrocarbons. And yet we've seen lower prices of hydrocarbons, and thanks to technology, we've seen a continued investment in renewables. The very technologies you would have thought it would have been marginalized by this haven't been, which I find very encouraging. But does that imply that there could be even a brighter future for renewables at a higher price because they've become not only economical, but profitable on a long-range basis if the price of energy is 40, 45, or 50 or above?
The non-hydrocarbon energy sources all get better because the technology makes them get better, regardless of price. I mean, that's the nature of. We've accelerated it somewhat with subsidies, but the improvements, by and large, weren't our subsidies. So the solar price collapsed with Chinese-driven subsidies. They subsidized the crystal silicon industry to produce wafers at the scale and prices that were. When I was traveling China before they came online, I visited 6 of those plants and knew when the solar PV prices were peaking, it was easy for me to tell the hedge fund I was working for, get out. Their price is going to collapse because these are going to all come online. So that was a subsidy. And I think Mark was saying earlier, we're on the asymptote of the price curve, right? We're approaching physics limits in solar, by the way. So physics limits actually matter. They actually do. You can make things cheaper by making the infrastructure cheaper, the installation cheaper, coatings can get a little better, but we're not going to see PV cells get half the price and twice the efficiency. They can't get there because the physics don't permit it. The other thing but doesn't mean there's no market. At the current prices, there's lots of global markets for it. It's just that they're not going to see the same price curve change. Same for wind turbines. Wind turbines have gone better because of scale and better blades, better motors, but they're not going to get twice as good. They're about where they're going to be. They're like aeroderivative turbines on wings. They'll get 1 or 2% better a year. But the thing that's missed in most of the calculation of people who are enthusiastic about renewables is that technology is agnostic. It makes everything better. Right? Shale's going to get better. Deep water's going to get better. Gas is going to get better. Coal gets better. So the chase is down the price curve. What you really want to know are where the physics limits are. And that's my bias because that's where I start from. But so if you look at physics limits for electric car, for example, we actually know the electrochemistry of batteries. We know what the physics limits are for energy density in battery. It's not magic. The number's known. We cannot make them 10 times better. They need to be 10 times better to beat oil. They can get maybe twice as good. We know we can make an internal combustion engine 5 to 6 times better than it is today if you wanted to pay the price. No one wants to pay the price. So the thermodynamic limits are all known numbers, and it's just technology gets better. Which one gets better faster? If I were betting, I would bet still that we're going to see a pace of change in the reduction of costs of hydrocarbons faster than the rate of change for the reduction in costs of non-hydrocarbons. That's the technology trend we're on now.
Yeah, let me just add a little bit to that because I pretty much totally agree with all of that. The one thing that's been different though is, especially with respect to solar and just photovoltaic panels, there was a time, I don't know, probably 5 years ago, where we got asked the question of when would we get to grid parity, and the answer was if the panels were free, we wouldn't be at grid parity. What has happened is we've become much better at construction. Our construction cost now is 1/3 what it was 5 or 6 years ago on an installed basis. We're much better at that now, and the same goes with wind too. If you've ever watched one of these big 1 megawatt windmills or 1.5 megawatt windmills go up, it's amazing how quickly it can be done now. So the construction techniques are getting better and better, and so we're getting faster at that, and that is actually taking a lot of the cost out of renewables, and that's something that you don't really think about, but it's those kinds of logistics that happen.
100% agree. So let me add, but they're on the asymptote. We got really good at it, and companies like yours pushed them down the asymptote, but you can't make the construction costs go to zero. They went down by 1/3 to 2/3. They're still going to stay in that range. PV panels aren't going to get much better. So for oil and gas guys, this is the metric to keep in mind. A 2 megawatt wind turbine today produces a barrel of oil equivalent energy every hour. That's what it produces. That doesn't make it oil. A typical small rig in the Permian produces a barrel of oil every second. Right? They both cost about the same, sort of. I mean, a 2 megawatt wind turbines, about $4 million. A small rig, about $4 million. So you have 1 barrel a second, 1 barrel an hour. The barrel an hour costs 300% more than the barrel a second, the actual economic cost of the output. 300% more for the wind turbine. It's on an asymptote that's slow. The shale rig, it's on an asymptote going down that's still fast. Then if I have to take that energy and drive a car with it, which is what everybody wants to do, I need 20,000 pounds of Tesla batteries to store 1 barrel of oil equivalent. 20,000 pounds. A barrel of oil weighs 300 pounds. Batteries may get twice as good if Elon Musk is successful. Maybe. That's still 10,000 pounds of batteries per barrel of oil equivalent with an input cost 300% higher than the oil. That's why, in my opinion, it never scales to replace the 50 million barrels of oil per day that are used for transportation in the world. It may replace, optimistically, 5 million of the new demand that's going to come along in the world, which would be huge. To your point, if you go from 0 to 5 million barrels per day, I'd love to invest in the companies that do that, but the 50 million stays.
We got to wrap it up and get to lunch. Lunch starts at 12:30. You've got to be back in here at 1:15 back in here for our keynote speech. There's going to be Adam Szymanski of the EIA,